Hi, I'm Anna Marie Cox, and I am the Charles de Gaulle of the supermarket world.
Hi, I'm Daniel Dresner, and Anna, just so you know, old trees want to hurt you, and I think they'd kill you if they could.
Welcome to Space the Nation, where we look at science fiction through the lens of
polyheuristic decision-making
and the brain multiverse. Today we'll be talking about Stephen King's 1980 novella, The Mist, although some of you might have encountered it in The Skeleton Crew, which was his first collection of short stories, although The Mist is not a short story, it's a novella.
It's a real novella.
It's a real novella. It is available at fine bookstores everywhere. It's also available on its own right now, but I think that's kind of a ripoff, Dan. It's really good. It's really good, but
look,
you should get it as part of the Skeleton Crew, unless you go ahead.
I don't mean to encourage piracy, but I'm pretty sure if you Google Stephen King's The Mist full text, you're going to find a way to read it without necessarily having to pay for it.
And also, I'm pretty sure Stephen King is going to be fined.
I don't think, you know what? Stephen King, okay. My wife took my daughter, to visit his estate in Maine. That's a thing to do when we go to Maine.
Yes.
So, he's doing well.
He's doing fine. Yeah. In the next few weeks, we'll be talking about Rebecca Roanhorse's Black Sun, and then our musical sci-fi episode.
This is right. This is actually a suggestion, I believe, from a patron who pointed out that we could probably we're going to do Buffy the Vampire Slayer once more with feeling, and then we will do Strange New Worlds Subspace Rhapsody.
We will not sing. That is my promise to you, dear listeners. Nope. This will be our sci-fi.
And you will thank us for that.
That's right. Because maybe we'll sing just enough so you understand why we're not singing.
Exactly. That's the only amount of singing we will do. Absolutely. We're agreed on that.
We have lots of ideas, but are always taking suggestions. The best way to do that is to become a patron and join our Discord, but we'll talk more about that later.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Dan, how are you?
I'm good, Anna, and I'm actually kind of feeling nostalgic because right now I am speaking to you not from my home, but rather from Los Angeles, California, which is where the American Political Science Association annual meeting is being held. And Anna, this holds a special place in my heart because we met at the American Political Science Association annual meeting. The first time we met in Chicago in 2004.
That is correct. Wow.
I invited you to participate in my blog panel, which, by the way, that panel remains the most well-attended thing I have ever done at Apple. I'm sure this was normal for you, but for me, having 300 people in the audience, not a normal thing for a political science, shindig. And that was a rockin', panel.
It was not about ethics in blogging, though.
It was not. And you know what? I still remember a line you said at that presentation.
What was it?
You said blogging makes bad writing look pretty. And that stuck with me. That really did stick with me.
Yep, it's true. It's all about the aesthetics.
Yep.
So, Dan, we are talking about The Mist.
Yes, we are. But first, I just did want to ask, how are you doing? It seems unfair that only I get covered.
Oh, yes. Well, I had a little mental health episode. We're going to call it an episode. Okay. Let's call it an episode.
Yeah.
A mental health thing I had to attend to this month. And I am still kind of babying myself a little bit, which probably is something for me to think about just
more generally.
As
someone who is encouraged, Anna, to baby herself on a slightly more regular basis, I'm down with this. I just want to say I'm down with the babying strategy.
Perhaps it shouldn't be called even babying myself. Perhaps it should be just called, living
with grace,
living without the high expectations that I have of myself. Dan, as you know, I shared with you, I really let the house go this week.
Yeah, it looks, just looking at it, I'm just, wow. That's...
Dan, there are dishes in the sink.
Oh my God.
And
yes. Yeah.
My bed was sometimes unmade. Now, I know that for a lot of people, it's not going to be slacking off, but for me, it's real victory. So thank you. Thank you for supporting me on this journey. Yeah.
Excellent.
All right.
So we should talk about why we're doing this. And Anna, I do have to kind of ask you, because I'm a little worried that I am horning in on one of your other podcasts. And I know how Stephen King plots go, and I'm worried what will happen to me if we do this.
You are correct that I am a part of a Stephen King podcast, a Stephen King dedicated podcast, where I love it. I don't think it's for everyone. I don't. Maybe they would not like it that I say that. But I mean, there are people who read Stephen King who number in the hundreds of millions, and then there are people who have like 3-hour conversations about a Stephen King book, and that's a slightly smaller number. But I am one of them. And in fact, I did the show this week. I did the podcast this week. We talked about Under the Dome, the TV adaptation of King's Under the Dome novel.
Oh, yeah, with like Natalie Martinez, I think it was.
And Dean Norris.
Ah, okay.
When he was also doing Breaking Bad, which makes it all the more crazy.
Oh, that's bizarre.
All the more crazy how terrible it is. It's almost a time capsule of like early teens TV, like when we had peak TV sort of happening, but also people spent a ton of money on these like network events, so-called.
Yeah,
this was advertised during the Super Bowl and everything. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I watched like 30 episodes of it.
They made 30 episodes
They made 39
of it?
episodes of it.
Oh my God, wow.
And it turns out, actually, the King podcast, I don't do it all the time. I'm just like a rotating guest.
Yeah.
They were like, oh my God, you watched that much? And I was like, aren't we supposed to? And they're like, oh no, we're just going to talk about it. I'm like, oh, well, okay.
Well, that seems a little lax, I'm going to say. You know, we generally consume the whatever it is we're talking about.
I don't know what the rules are over there, but it is a good episode if you're into that kind of thing. The reason we're talking about The Mist, though, is that it is a belated entry into hot sci-fi summer.
This is true. Technically, it opens with literally hot sci-fi summer.
Yeah, it is a hot sci-fi summer in the story.
Yes,
it takes place at the end of a heat wave. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I thought maybe reading it would bust the heat dome. Look, I'm bringing everything together. All the threads. All the threads coming together.
Nice. Well, also, like, there's a way in which
that I'm living in. I'm in a heat dome right now.
I know. But there's like a perfect... this is actually a way in which it's perfectly transitioned, like in the story, from hot sci-fi summer to potentially the cooler narratives that we're going to be exploring in the fall.
Yes, that's true. All right. So, Dan, I have loved this for a long time. It doesn't have the twist ending that the movie does. I think people should know that. However,
yes,
should people stop this podcast right now and pick it up and read it if they have not already?
I am going to say yes, Anna, for two reasons. The first is there are plot developments, and I think you don't want to know about them as you are reading it. And second, and equally important, it's a novella. This is 100 pages, basically, maybe a little longer. It is not going to take you that long to read it. And also, for those of you who have only watched the movie, definitely read it because it's different, mostly in a superior way. Apparently, the movie is reasonably well reviewed, and we'll talk about that in a second. But and as you point out, the ending of the novella is very different from the ending of the film.
Yes.
And what do you think? You would agree with this?
I think people should read it. We'll talk at length about this. It's one of my favorite King pieces, and it's super short, and it's really good, and it does have developments that you're going to want to be surprised by.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Yes, if you have not read it, stop the pod right now. And then go listen to a Meg episode. Because you definitely don't have to have seen those movies to enjoy those episodes.
Very true. Absolutely true.
Catch up on the Meg episodes.
Yeah.
Take an hour or two to read the short story novella and then come back.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm now having this envisioning of what if they had made The Mist starring Jason Statham. It's got tentacles on her.
Yeah. Oh, you love that Statham voice.
I do. It's awful.
We need to do more, I guess, more Statham stuff. So
we clearly
we
need
have
more
to do
Statham,
the Punisher.
Yes.
I suppose. Oh, wait. Is that Thomas Jane? That's Thomas Jane.
That's Thomas Jane. Thomas Jane's in The Punisher. Yeah.
Yeah, Thomas Jane, who's also in The Mist.
The Mist. He's the protagonist of The Mist.
I feel like Jason Statham has a Punisher connection. He's
I don't
in
think so.
Something that's maybe one of the directors of The Punisher, because it's a how did this get made
okay.
connection I'm thinking about. But we can just move on. We'll think of other ways to get
Let's
Statham
get to
accents
Let's get to the previous experience with this. Anna, I think it's safe to say this novella holds a place near and dear to your heart.
Yes. So I'm a huge King head in general. I've probably read this particular story, at least 3 or 4 times, perhaps more. And I know the number's really high up there because this is one of the first King stories I ever read.
Mm-hmm. How old were you?
I was 13.
Oh, wow.
My first King book was Christine,
Mm-hmm.
which I loved. And
Mm-hmm.
then this is from Skeleton Key, and that is the thing that came out in 1985.
80. Yeah.
The 80 is when it was first published. 85 is when it came out in Skeleton Key.
Right.
Or Skeleton Crew, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So I fell in love. It started a long, or at least throughout high school career of me arguing with English teachers about whether or not Stephen King was a literary author.
Oh, I can imagine those English teachers being snooty about it.
They were. This is, of course, long before he appeared in The New Yorker, which I love for him. I just do. I mean, I think that probably scratched an itch for him. And also it made me want to send it to like my old English teachers to be like, see, I only have a vague memory of seeing the movie for the first time. I know that I saw it, but as regular listeners know, there's a period of the late aughts and early teens where I don't have a super good memory of all the things that I did. So that I think falls into that category.
And in my case, this was the first time I read the novella, but I've done the work here, Anna, because in a funny story, when we agreed we were going to do The Mist, I think, in retrospect, this was probably my memory, because I think you probably said at one point we were talking about actually doing the novella. My experience with this was a little different, Anna, in that I had never read the novella, but I can say I put in the work because due to a slight miscommunication at Space the Nation headquarters, I assumed originally we were doing The Mist, the film. And so I downloaded it and was starting to watch it. And thank God I texted Anna saying, Anna, I'm not sure I'm supposed to be laughing at the film as much as I am. At which point we realized, no, we're supposed to be doing the novella. Yeah. But I'm actually glad I watched the film in that it makes me appreciate the novella more. Yeah. Because the novella works in a way that I don't think the film does.
No.
This is not Frank Darabont's best adaptation of a Stephen King project. It's a little weird, actually.
It's a little weird. Some people consider it to be very good. The ending is infamous. The
ending is amazing. Like, I will say this: he took a big swing on the ending.
He took a big swing on the ending.
That is a brutal ending.
It's just spoiler alert: brutal ending.
Yeah.
I will say that I think it suffers from being, like 15 years old or so. Like the creature effects are.
Oh, the creature effects don't help. No, they're not good. You know what the creature effects reminded me of? They reminded me of the TV show Galaxy Quest at the beginning of Galaxy Quest.
Yeah,
they're not good.
They're real bad. They're real.
Yeah, the tentacles in particular. I was like, oh, come on, man.
Which is very disappointing because the novella contains, I think, some genuinely like gross, scary stuff.
Yes.
The creatures are described in a way like,
And what's weird is that like Darabont actually upped the ante in terms of the gore in a lot of cases. Like the gore that you see in the film, where you're supposed to be shocked by, is worse than a lot of what King wrote about. Yeah. But it's not the same. No.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting example of there's a little bit of a rule of thumb that the closer a work hews to King's vision. It's closer a film hews to King's vision, the less successful it will be.
It's interesting because
the best King adaptation is The Shining, which is just takes the book as kind of an idea and then goes from there. And there's that's an interesting counterexample too, because The Mist is interesting as a discussion point because it's a good example of how the closer a work hews to King's original vision, the less successful it is as a film.
Interesting.
And if you think about what the absolute best King adaptation is, it's The Shining.
The Shining, right? Yeah.
Which takes the book as a very loose kind of like aroma.
It takes the vibe from the show.
It takes the vibe. Yeah. It has a Shining vibe, and that's an interesting thing. There's a direct comparison because there is a version of The Shining that's a TV movie that King was an executive producer on. And it is not as good. And I think King has recently actually allowed. Like he used to famously not like the Kubrick version of The Shining, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. One of like top 10, I think, for me in general. This, as you I think will have noticed, has like direct dialogue lifted from the novella.
A
It is
lot
like
of it
the
is directly
script.
lifted.
The script is basically they basically just lifted the dialogue from the novella and put it in this movie, and it doesn't work as well.
No, it really doesn't. Which, by the way, it works in the novella. A lot of it does, but a bit like it. Yeah, there's stuff that like when they say it out loud, it's like no.
It's very interesting. Yeah. He's very literary, our king, as I would tell I had to sit in the hall once. I got really heated with a English teacher in 7th grade.
Oh, I can picture 12-year-old Anna really going to town, going at it on that one. Yep.
All right.
Let's get to the story behind the story. Anna, I will say that one of the things I was worried about as we started reading this, because I know this was written right around the time during his Richard Bachman days. And like, we've talked about Mexican writing binges, and I don't know if we're going to say the same thing about Stephen King, but like, this is such a short thing. I was like, please tell me Stephen King did not write this in a 48-minute Richard Bachman bender.
He may well have been on a bender.
There we go.
This was written in the late 70s, probably was originally published in 1980, which is pre-cocaine King.
It's true. There's a lot of drinking in this, but no drugs.
Well, he rarely has drugs in his books in general, but the way you can tell the cocaine era King from the beer era King is mainly in how much he wrote. In the 1980s, Dan.
Yes.
He wrote 12 novels.
That is just...
And short stories. And I think he also put out Danse Macabre, his like nonfiction book. Wow. So, and the Bachman novels.
And the Bachman, not including the Bachman novels? Jesus Christ.
Well, some of the Bachman novels. He wrote them kind of late 70s, early 80s. So most of King's stuff, I believe you cannot, unless you're really, really looking. Mm-hmm. It's hard to tell like whether he was in his sober period or not. And I mean that as a compliment, right?
Right.
I don't.
He's a good writer.
You don't see it very much. His preoccupation with sobriety pre-existed him getting sober.
Yeah, and by the way, I do think let me put it this way. There was a reason why I asked that question.
Yeah.
With this, because and it's also, by the way, interestingly enough, the biggest difference I think between the film and the book and the novella. It's fascinating in that sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of drinking in the book, and I do think that is a product. That's a close. That's a tell, but not one that would be super obvious to people. I think, just for trivia's sake, the last book he wrote when he was in the height of his using, which is beer and cocaine, apparently, was the Tommyknockers, which is a lot of people's it's in the bottom 5 for a lot of people. I kind of love it because it's so weird. It's about aliens that come to Earth and make people really geniuses about making things, like tinkerers. And then they also sort of subtly change their physiology. And there is an alcoholic in it who's safe from the alien head games because he has a metal plate in his head. It is a wild ride. The other book that is, you can kind of tell, not everything was super normal, chemical wise, is Dreamcatcher, which maybe people have read or seen the movie, both of which are really weird and bad. And Dreamcatcher was written when King was recovering from that terrible accident that he was in, that you may recall. He was
this was in the 2000s, right?
He was basically run off the side of a road. Not run off the side of a road. He was run over on the side of a road by a van while he was on one of his daily walks in Maine. And he says he wrote Dreamcatcher just gobbling oxys. So I think he does not count that as a relapse because it was in the service of a period where he was undergoing
Sure. No, he needed pain relief, but nonetheless,
maybe he should not have written a novel. That is what maybe. But he's also talked about how bored he was and how terrible. It was a very formative time for him as a writer. You can see the themes of that come up in his later stuff. If you want to listen to a 3 or 4 hour discussion of some of that, you can listen to the Losers Club, a bloody disgusting podcast available wherever podcasts are sold or downloaded or whatever.
Yes, fair enough.
One more thing about the story behind the story, which is this was also adapted into a terrible TV series that I remember being very excited about. and then did not finish. And I'm not even just it existed. That's all people need to know.
They made this into a television series? Like
series.
That I have to say, like having read this is like maybe you could do like a 2-part movie or something, but like anything beyond that, you are stretching way beyond the source material.
Oh, I need to say, I am on the panel for, I think, both the Tommyknockers and Dreamcatcher for the Losers Clubs episodes. So if you want to hear me go off about how these are like really kind of classics, I'm actually, the episodes that I've done for Losers Clubs are almost all like things that other people don't want to do.
Right, because like, you've done Under the Dome as well.
I did Under the Dome, and then also I did, he wrote a Bachman King, like 2 books that were kind of interrelated, Desperation, and then I can't remember the name of the other one, although Desperation is actually the one I have right here next to me, and the other one was called Regulators, The Regulators.
Oh, okay.
And those are also not especially fondly looked on by a lot of people, but the weirder King, I love the kind of weirder stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And also I did another episode that was about sobriety and King, recovery and King.
Oh,
so
interesting.
If people want to look that up, we can move on and talk about our podcast.
Yes.
Chekhov's What's It. That's what we're doing. Click.
Yep. This is the thing that often appears in the first act of whatever it is that we're reading that winds up recurring and playing a role in the third act. I have to say, it was actually kind of hard to find one in this case, Anna. I have Chekhov's Arrowhead Project. I mean, military-industrial complex. Like, sure. It's sort of vaguely referred to throughout the book and potentially is the fault of what winds up ensuing. But I don't think there's a ton that is like referenced and then winds up being called back to.
I think that's actually a mark of a good piece of writing in a way, that there's nothing like super obvious.
There's nothing obvious, right?
You know, that's going to come back later. I just have Chekhov's Scout, like Chekhov's 4-wheel drive.
Which is technically, no, that's absolutely fair. Yeah.
So now for book episodes, your brain was broken when we did
yes,
The Gone World.
Yes.
And so we had to reassess how we do book episodes.
Absolutely correct. We probably could have done this one under the old rules because King's plot is very clean in that way. So I have no apologies to that. But generally speaking, whenever we do either like television series, like seasons or books, we instead of going through the plot in a very detailed way, we will talk about sort of provide the jacket blurb version of the plot. Then we'll talk about the characters and so on and so forth. So let's get to the jacket blurb. What happens when a small Maine vacation town confronts something inexplicable? What usually happens in a Stephen King novella? All kinds of bad shit. A storm hits the lake town of Bridgeton, Maine, knocking out the power and blowing out trees everywhere. The next day, our protagonist, David Drayton, his small son, Billy, and his not-so-nice out-of-town neighbor, Brent Norton, carpool into town to go grocery shopping at Federal Foods. As they are waiting in line to check out, a straight-line mist that David had seen on the lake earlier in the day envelops the town. Someone runs into the store yelling, "There's something in the fog!" Which, again, Anna, in terms of the movie, this was a bad sign. When the actor who did that came in, I did just immediately laugh. Like, it was not, and I shouldn't have had to do that. So, but yeah. And that's not fake news, Anna. Everyone stays in the store.
No,
true. Sorry. I apologize. You're right. Almost everyone stays in the store.
Some people leave and they hear the screams.
Right. Some people leave. They hear the screams. A mother of small children actually does leave the store because she has to get back to her children. An attempt to fix the store's generator causes David and manager Ollie to see tentacles, grab one of the bagging clerks, and kill him. They try to inform the other denizens, and folks at the store, including Norton, managers Bud and Ollie, school teacher Mrs. Repler, and local religious fanatic Mrs. Carmody, have a variety of reactions. Things get worse that evening when giant winged insects and even larger pterodactyl-like buzzards attack the store through the front glass. The community within the store starts to crack up. The locals resent the out-of-towners, the blue-collar folks think they're being talked down to by the educated, and Anna, an awful lot of people respond to the situation by drinking. An excursion to the neighboring pharmacy ends disastrously. Mrs. Carmody begins quoting from the Book of Revelations, attracting more and more followers. Eventually, David, Billy, Ollie, Mrs. Repler, and a few others decide they have no choice but to make a run for David's scout and flee the scene. They escape the store, but not without casualties. Will the remaining survivors survive for much longer? King leaves the ending ambiguous, but as someone who grew up in the Farmington Valley, Anna, this is the first book I have ever read where the word Hartford is viewed as a sign of hope.
Well, it's an insurance capital.
The insurance capital of the world. Anna, does that about sum it up?
I think that we should dwell just a little bit on the opening scene setting.
Yeah.
Because I think that's some of his best writing.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And it conjures up what's going to be destroyed, right? Which is very important in any kind of horror novel. Like, it's not just there's a domesticity. He writes about the wife and his kid and their home, and not just their home, but like the way it feels for him. Right?
Yeah, there's an idyllic aspect. I mean, there is an idyllic aspect to our protagonist's life, and also, like as you said, like this was, and again, this was the problem with the film version. In the film version, you're at like maybe the 12 or 13 minute mark when things go sideways, and it escalates way too goddamn quickly, and so it doesn't set the stage well at all. In the novella, King's economy of prose is amazing, and like I love the depiction of the home. I also love the depictions of when Brent comes over and he doesn't like Brent eyeballing his wife. Like, again, it's like there's maybe a page of that. Not that much, but it's enough.
Well, again, economy of prose and also playing out the line enough so that things get complicated already. Like, there's already relationships that we recognize.
Right, exactly.
And complicated relationships. Because what I love about what he does with Norton, his neighbor, is you see Norton as human, first of all.
Exactly, yes. You're right.
You see him trying to start his chainsaw. And not being able to, and we understand that he's lost his wife recently, and he's been grieving, and they have a moment of human connection.
You're right,
and also really important for the rest of the book.
I agree, and the other nice thing about that is that Drayton acknowledges that like there was a petty side of him that was enjoying that, but he also recognizes, oh man, wait, this is a moment when we actually have to like, play nice and we have to be friends and so on and so forth. Like, you're right. And again, this all happens in the span of maybe 10 pages. It's not a lot of prose, but he does a great job of setting that up. And then, so when the horrors do come, the stakes are there. We understand what our protagonist is giving up. This is all, and like even references to Mrs. Carmody in the past, like, like wind up playing a role.
And when Norton goes in the direction he goes, there is a sense of betrayal and what could have been, and
there's a sense of tragedy.
It's a sourness and a tragedy to it that wouldn't be there in the movie. He's just kind of a dick the entire time. Like, there's a little bit like that actor
Andre Braugher,
great, and so he gives enough subtlety to it that you kind of see some of that, but not enough, right?
I hate to say this. One of my takeaways from watching the film, and this is a legitimate thing, it's a side point to this, but like Andre Braugher has had an amazing television career. Mm-hmm. He's iconic in Homicide. He's iconic in Brooklyn Nine-Nine. But his film choices, Andre, you need a good agent because like you can do amazing work and you're being put in stuff that like, it just like, this is one of his better film roles is the way I would put it. I'm not kidding. Like, I've seen him in other stuff.
I'm not going to say he does a lot with a little. He does some with a little.
Yeah. Right. I agree.
But so, and I have some stuff I'm probably going to put into Refield that they're just some pieces of writing from that first section that I think are, again, King at his most economical best.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. This raises the obvious question. How is this science fiction different from all other science fictions? And Anna, I think my answer is that I don't think it is, in that this is a very simple story, and I think it's a plot that King has used before. It's just a simple story that is well told. I think three things come out, having read this novella. The first is, and I'm sorry, this really affected me, the drinking. Jesus Christ, the drinking, Anna. There is a lot of drinking in this, and like a lot of drinking that like, I'm not a teetotaler, but I'm like reading this, it's like, who thinks having a beer at 10 a.m. to like chainsaw stuff is like perfectly normal? It was like just weird, and maybe like in the 1980s this was perfectly normal, but it was very strange.
I think there's a little time warp problem, and then there's also what was normal for King.
Yes, exactly. Well, I was going to say, like, King is telling on himself in those things. Like, he's also telling on himself when he has the idea. He keeps saying, "Oh yeah, I'll leave it." Like, basically, from the moment the incident happens in the back, I don't think there's a moment where Ollie is not drinking. And yet in King's version of it, he's drinking constantly. He just never gets drunk because according to King, he just sweats it out. And that's not how alcohol works, Anna.
Nope.
No.
Nope.
Nope, 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 nope. And Brent is drinking. Norton drinks constantly. Our protagonist is drinking. I loved how there was a wino section versus a beer section in the store. But like it was honestly like it was.
It's almost distracting.
Yeah, it really no. It was off-putting. It's the one thing that I was like, ooh, I don't know about this. And like again, it starts from like page 5 on. Like So
At least in The Shining, he's supposed to be an alcoholic.
Right, exactly. But in theory, in all of these characters, they're not supposed to be alcoholics. I'm like, no, they're all alcoholics, Anna. Like pretty like they're treated as such. So that it's a what like it, that was why I this is why I texted you asking this question, because like reading this, it was like, oh, you do not have a grasp on your drinking yet, do you, Stephen King?
Yeah.
The brevity. This is a very quick read. It shouldn't be any longer. He really does so much with short, simple sentences. I mean, it's almost Hemingway-esque at times, like in terms of the writing, and it's incredibly well done. And it is also, and this is actually does come through in the movie, but it also comes through in the book. This is just a incredibly effective microcosm of white America. And let's be clear, it's white America. Okay, this is like Maine. Rural Maine. It's Maine. Yeah, I mean, there is Andre Braugher in the film, but like in the book, these are all white people. Let's be blunt. And yeah, it's like cross-cutting resentments. It's like the out-of-towners versus the locals, the educated versus the sort of blue-collar guys, the people who are like in the normal times leaders versus during emergency times, and so forth. Like it really. It effectively portrays what he does is he creates this little society and shows how it falls apart.
Yes. And I think that what is different about it is kind of just the skill, right?
Yeah.
It is just how good it is, because it's a familiar plot in 1,000 different ways. It's a familiar plot because it's a genre plot, invasion, aliens, that's our podcast, right? And then it's also an incredibly familiar King plot. He has about 10 of them, that he does different versions of. And
do you have a favorite King plot? I'm curious.
I like the apocalyptic ones.
Yeah. Okay.
I like The Stand is one of my favorite King books. I also like he does do just scary, right? Just like monster. Yeah. So It is one of my favorites as well. I think the apocalyptic and the sort of creature or big bad ones are my favorite. But he also does
both. Yeah.
And this one also is a particular version of apocalyptic, which is when you put a bunch of people together in a crisis situation, like what happens, right?
No, this is in some ways a zombie. Like it isn't, but it fits the zombie genre as well, because the zombie genre is never about the zombies. It's about how people react to that.
Right.
And that's really what this book is concerned with. I mean, the creature stuff is interesting, and King delivers on that. As you say, the descriptions are, again, like it's like a pointille. It's like 3 brushstrokes, and you know what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly effective. But it's the interpersonal stuff that's really fascinating.
And what's interesting is that is a favorite plot of his, is you throw a bunch of people together in the end of the world. And this version is 100 and something pages. And then there's The Stand.
Yes.
So when we say he has a couple different plots, there are ways to do very different things with the same plot, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think this is just a particularly good version of his small town folks forced into close quarters to fight a supernatural force. And it's an unusual version of his typical Mary Sue.
And by Mary Sue, do you mean because I would push back. I don't think David's a Mary Sue. So like,
yeah, I guess I should. Okay. He's not a Mary Sue, and that is
okay. Yeah,
that's unfair to call it a Mary Sue. But as people who might have read even just 2 or 3 King books know, his protagonists tend to be writers or school teachers. Like they tend to have something that they do something that King did, which is right what you know. That's fine. Yeah. Right. As he's gone on in his career, he's kind of varied it a bit. But in this, we have a character who's definitely not King. Even though he's a creative professional, he's an artist, he's a commercial artist.
Right.
And I think it's interesting. And I kind of wonder, so King had Carrie, right? Which was like this out
huge
of
success.
Nowhere, huge success. I think he got paid I think it's in the hundreds of dollars maybe that he got paid I mean,
Oh my
maybe a
God.
couple thousand, by Putnam, I think. And then, of course, it's his career. And ever since then, he has not had a book that tanked, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think it's interesting, and I wonder what he was going through, that he wrote this character whose career is financially fine,
But
but he's not an artist. Like, he's not.
Well, so let me put it this way. What I wonder is, again, during the time, I think the Stephen King of today is probably pretty comfortable with where he stands in sort of the annals of American letters. I am quite confident. You please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm betting the Stephen King of the late 1970s was actually extremely anxious about where he stood. That he was a commercial success, but I don't think he was a critical success at that point. And I wonder so in other words, I think maybe he saw a little more of himself in David than maybe you think, because he thought of himself as, or maybe he had internalized a little too much of the criticism.
I guess that's what I mean when I'm trying to say. It's like, his protagonists that bear somewhat of a resemblance to him tend to be writers who are doing okay, or weirdly school teachers. That's kind of his two big things. This is just a particularly interesting one that has a monologue and has some thoughts. I think some of the most interesting stuff in the story about his career, and he has apparently a famous, like a Frank Wythe, like sort of father. Seems like Christina Standing Alone hangs in the White House, his father's masterpiece. And I think that is King kind of working through, like, am I okay just like selling a cajillion copies of something?
Right.
I think he is.
I think he now is. I'm not sure if he was okay. I'm not sure if he was okay then. But the other thing I will say is that this is an interesting character in terms of the self-knowledge that he has.
Yeah.
And that made him. Speaking of
I think that David, just a little bit more about David. I think David has comfort with who he is.
Right.
I think you're right. The King of that period,
does not
know.
Yes, that's correct.
Through the character of David, I think King is working on that.
Interesting.
And it is also interesting to me, though, the ambivalent or the complication of, he feels very comfortable with his being like a commercial artist.
Right.
Fine. Mm-hmm. He also is not one of the competent people in the store.
No, this is what I found legitimately fascinating. And maybe this is something that makes it different, because it's written as if he is the leader of his group in terms of rationality, in terms of survival, and so on and so forth. And yet he is far from the most competent character. He fucks up repeatedly during, this thing. His instincts might have been okay, but he doesn't handle Norton well. That whole exchange where he realizes intuitively he wants to have Norton on his side so he can calm everyone else. That's a good instinct. But the way he tries to persuade Norton is horribly handled. And,
and I think he realizes that, but after.
But in some ways and that's where the structure of this works, because the structure of the novella is he's writing this after all of these events, trying to say what he did. And I think in some ways, there's a way in which by writing it, presumably Drayton is this is where I screwed up. This is where, this is where we made mistakes and so forth. Yeah. But in the moment, he screws up a number of times on this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I worth reading, y'all, if you haven't already at this point. He does, as you said it, there is so much in this 100 and something story.
It really is. Yeah. Yeah, no, it packs a punch, yes.
So speaking of which, we've talked about David Drayton a bunch.
Right.
Dan, other characters?
Well, as you say, I think the thing that struck me reading this is the way in which King valorizes competency under stress, which David does not. I mean, he's not the worst by far, but he's also not the best. So the two characters that stood out to me by far are Ollie and Mrs. Repler, the teacher. They are, Ollie in particular is I actually wish, to the extent that I wish there was more description, I wanted to hear more about Ollie. Yeah. Because it's this question of how does this assistant store manager, behave, who when the shit gets, rough, he's the only one who can fire a gun. He's the one who has a better read of people, and he's the one whose death, just a, spoiler alert, is in some ways the most tragic.
I did love Toby Jones in that role.
He was great. Yes, I agree. Toby Jones was fantastic. And I think was the best thing in the film. Yeah. In terms of the casting, Toby Jones was great. And also I will say Laurie Holden was the perfect choice to play Amanda, I think is her name.
Yeah, Amanda.
Which we'll talk about in a second.
Yeah.
And Frances Steenburgen plays Mrs. Repler in the film. She's great also. I like the portrayal of Mrs. Carmody. I have to admit, like, I'm not as much deep into the King oeuvre as you are. So, like, I know that religious fanatics are a recurring theme in King novels, but I will say,
like fundamentalist Christians, that is a big time hobby horse for him.
Let me put it this way: King does something structural about the Mrs. Carmody character that I think works well, which is her first instincts when the mist comes are actually accurate.
Yeah.
And so, and there, like, there's a couple other times where she says something like, "Oh, whoa, she knew that," or like, she knew it for crazy reasons, or she's guessing, whatever. But the point is that she's right just enough so that you can't completely dismiss her as a loon, and because she becomes lunatic very quickly. But like, I think structurally, by making her right in like her initial instincts, it gives the character a touch more weight than perhaps the sort of standard religious villain.
Yeah, I think she is in the, on the bell curve of his success with portraying fundamentalist Christians as actual humans.
Right, exactly. I agree.
She is towards the human side, and I think
not completely, but definitely trending in that direction.
But there's definitely, and also there's a complication with her too, right? Which is that she starts out making sense, and also I don't think she doesn't turn to the blood sacrifice stuff right away.
No, but she does go there pretty quickly.
It goes pretty fast. Yeah. But her first kind of talk about this stuff, it makes kind of sense. Yeah, sure. Yeah. This does seem like the end times.
Yeah. You can understand why she goes in that direction.
The speed with which she goes to blood sacrifice is the tell about how he feels about fundamentalist Christians. Yeah,
exactly. Though that was the one thing where it felt like the movie, I guess would be the way to put it. Where it's like, nope, too fast, just slow down your roll. And then, the Brent Norton character, who's only in it for half the novella, I think. But as you say, like, is in there during the crucial early scenes in terms of the scene setting. And like, in some ways, in terms of like figuring out the interior life of the character, beyond Drayton, that's the other one and Billy, that's the other character you really get to know. And so I thought that was, very well done. What about you, Anna?
Well, I think we have to talk about Amanda Dumfries, Dan.
I resisted on this one, but I'm happy to talk about her now. So yes.
She is the very hot, hot pants. She's not wearing literally hot pants. But her pants get commented upon a lot, and then he's into them. He's into them in more ways than one, if you know what I mean, Dan.
Wink, nudge, nudge. Yes.
She's, King's not great with female. Well, I could do a whole episode about. I have lots to say about King and female characters, but she's fine as a character. Yeah. I will say 13-year-old Anna was fascinated by this. Because it's in the extreme. In extremis, they have sex, right? Right. Yep. Like, he's married. She's married. She's
married as well. In fact, she calls out, I believe, her husband's name while they're having sex.
Yes. But it's the end of the world. And so they have sex, and I remember number one, hadn't had sex myself yet, so I was like, yeah, you'd want to do that. That would be on my list.
So Anna, I want to say, like, that is the classic teenage thinking about the end of the world. Because I've seen things, I remember watching things like, oh yeah, absolutely. If it's the end of the world and you haven't had sex, you got to do that. That's like,
you got to have sex. Yeah, sure.
As you get older, you realize that maybe that's not the most realistic things of how things would go down. But yeah.
At 13, I thought this actually makes sense to me, though. Like, yes, it seemed like a realistic version of the thing that's kind of a joke. Right. Right. Yeah. And also, I remember being very kind of pondering the morality of it. Like, little young me, like all teenagers have a huge moral streak, right? Like, just
really? I'm shocked to hear that. Yes. Yes.
And kind of understanding, like, is that wrong? Like, you're laughing, but like, I think
no. It's let me put it this way. The problem is that it's fiction, but like, you're right. If you really take seriously what's going on, it is a question worth asking. Like, if you really do think the world's going to end, and Drayton doesn't say it, but like, it's clear he thinks his wife is probably dead.
Yeah. I don't know. Like, for 13-year-old me, it was like a very interesting like way of thinking about things that I had not like thought about.
The thing that I was kind of stunned by was like, again, it's the brevity. It's a half-page scene. Like, literally, I think it's like
he does not. Oh my God. On the other podcast, we have a section we call Pound Cake. and it's devoted to King writing about sex.
I'm sorry, I love that it's called Pound Cake. That's
Well,
great.
yeah, and they're not good. They're not good.
No.
Quotes.
I
They're not.
I guess the thing I will say about Kate, like in this case, brevity works for him because
Yep,
it was.
sure.
I remember reading and thinking, okay, yeah, sure, fine. It's clear. It actually, in some ways, it works even better because it works even better for the moral question because it's clear that in the context of the way Drayton's writing it, it's like we just want each other. Let's get this done. And like literally, it's like it's never talked about the entire rest of except when Mrs. Carmody yells "whore."
Yeah,
but like that's the only other time it's mentioned. So yes, I agree.
All right, we can move on from that. We've talked about it longer than King thought about it. So,
but I will close with this. Laurie Holden in the movie does a nice job, and in some ways, like actually, it made like it. She does a better job of that character, even though they don't have the sex scene. But Darabont, that was one of the good things he does. He sort of plays the attraction in a more low key way, and I actually like the way he handled it.
Yeah. I want to talk about Ollie for just a second.
Yeah.
King, before he could actually say characters were gay,
yes.
he tended to have this kind of character come in every once in a while, where I think King is like, so for me, he's infamously like boomer liberal, right?
Mm-hmm.
He wants to be on the right side of stuff. He really does. And he wants to signal, I'm okay with gay people. Or not wants to signal. I guess he also just knows they exist. I shouldn't be too. It's not that he wants to display that.
No, the way I would put it is, I don't know how to describe this, but you can. There's a sentence where King describes Ollie where you can tell he's sort of grasping in the dark to try to figure out how he's. I think he knows intuitively what's going on, but he can't actually say it. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think he really loves that character too, and that comes through. Which is one of the things one of the many things I love about King. Again, I could go on. When he loves his characters, and he tends to love all of them. Even his villains. There's a lot of affection and care that you feel like he doesn't hate the people he's writing about, even when he's writing. And that's why sometimes
even when they're doing hateful things,
is a problem because those are the characters every once in a while he hates.
They're
not as good. Yeah. So I liked Ollie a lot. I liked his competency. I loved that he's just a sharpshooter.
So the sentence that made me think. The sentence that made me think of all this was where he says, "I always had the idea that Ollie was a little afraid of girls," and I was like, "Oh, so Ollie's gay then?" Just to be clear, that was my reaction.
And that's just the only in 1980 or 1970 whatever.
Right.
And he has a pinky ring too. That's the other thing about Ollie.
Yeah.
I want to give a shout out to David's relationship with Billy, which you and I texted a bit about, which I found as the child skeptic found incredibly endearing and true to life. Although I guess we could say that I could compare to how I feel about my pets, but I don't think people don't like it when you do that.
No, Let me put it this way: the thing that King gets right in the novella,
it feels really right. To me, you are the expert.
It's the roller coaster of emotion is the way I would put it. He actually does get into Billy's head and where he's fearful and then he's happy and there's a sentence he's got where he talks about being utterly scared about how adaptable kids are.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a great way of describing how Billy is throughout most of this book. And it's you feel David's love for his child and his need to protect his child. And I think also the other thing that comes through is this lurking dread that David has that he loves and wants to protect his child and he's not sure he can.
Yeah.
And, it's unstated, but it works really well. Yeah.
I can't remember the exact line, but it's in that first part that I think is so important where he talks about the ways that parents imagine bad things happening to their kids.
Right.
That fear that comes. And that's a loved one thing. It's not just a kid's thing, right? But I know that there is a special kind of terror for parents, mm-hmm. right? And that is an undercurrent throughout the story, is that his fear about something bad happening to Billy, his fear of not being able to do anything about it, mm-hmm. and a fear that he's already done something, that there's already something that's broken that he's not going to be able to fix. I think Again, there's so much happening in this very short piece.
No, again, he
I want
packs
to
a
teach it now that I'm thinking. Now that I'm talking about it, like
I
there's
think
just
you
a lot
absolutely.
going on.
If you teach another creative writing class, this I see why this would go on the syllabus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to talk more about Mrs. Carmody, but I think we have talked about her.
Yeah,
Again,
I think
probably
so.
more that King really thought about her. So rather than discuss her any further, I have a question, Dan.
Oh, yes, Anna?
Is there IR in this novella?
Jesus Christ, in a chariot-driven sidecar, Anna. Of course there's IR in this novella.
Did you just try to do a Maine accent, Dan?
No, I did not.
Okay. All right.
Do you want me to try that? Because I don't think it would not go well. No.
It's all right.
No.
Good. Continue. Yeah. Why don't you read the rest in Jason Statham accent?
It's an interesting spin on it. No. Okay. It is an interesting spin on what is a standard genre premise, which is when everything goes to hell, what happens to society and what is the source of power. Traditionally, what happens in these scenarios is that, traditional sources of authority break down. It's whoever has the guns. What's interesting to me is that that's not how it works in this story. In this story, the source of power is the power of persuasion. So can David convince Norton that what he saw in the back was real, and thereby having Norton confirm it and then, communicate it to everyone else? Can Mrs. Carmody persuade others that actually, no, this is just the end times and we all need to follow the rules according to the book of Revelation? So David thinks about this in explicitly political terms. There's a sequence where, Amanda and Mrs. Repler and Ollie are saying, I think we need to get out of the store. And it's because Mrs. Carmody is starting to attract more adherents to her theology. And after they sell this to David, David says, and let me quote here, I understood the worry on their faces. It was enough to make them the largest political force in the market, especially now that Dan and Mike were gone. The thought that the biggest single group in our closed system was listening to her rant about the pits of hell and the 7 vials being open made me feel pretty damn claustrophobic. So it's the only worst use of the word political in the entire novella, but it's actually entirely on point. And the interesting thing, again, what makes this a good novel is that the question of persuasion is not a de novo thing. It's not like, even though they're all thrown into a unique situation, everyone is coming into this scenario with pre-existing prejudices, pre-existing class resentments, and those things affect how these people respond. It explains why Norton isn't persuaded by David. It explains why some of the blue collar guys don't like what David says at first and wind up following Mrs. Carmody. And that's interesting. So on the one hand, it's a little, anarchical society, and there's a way in which power in the end does flow from the barrel of the gun, namely Ollie's ability to actually shoot. But the real source of power in this novella is the power to attract. And in this situation, the only things that seem to attract are A, competency, and B, religion. And in some ways the novel is a scary suggestion that religion often wins out in those scenarios. And for understandable reasons, because things that are unexplainable are happening. And when things that are unexplainable are happening, it's tough for rationality or competency to win out. It becomes easier to say, we need to have a theology to explain what's going on.
So there is also a part where he does a little sociology, Dan. Mm-hmm. And I'm surprised you didn't bring it up because there's a mention of zombies. So
it's true. Yeah.
I thought that your ears,
the zombie radar gets pricked. Yes.
So he's talking about how he's talking to a novelist friend, and that the Weird Tales magazine went broke in the 50s. And I don't know if I quite buy this, but I'll quote it. So when machines fail, he had said, while his wife candled the eggs and roosters crowed querulously outside, when the technologies fail, when the conventional religious systems fail, people have got to have something. Even a zombie lurching through the night can seem pretty cheerful compared to the existential comedy horror of the ozone layer dissolving under the combined assault of 1 million fluorocarbon spray cans of deodorant. So I think it's not entirely clear to me what he's saying here, actually.
So I think live this way. I think King is trying to make a distinction between religion in these sort of traditional Protestant, like high church version of religion, and then Mrs. Carmody and these sort of more,
wackadoodle.
Yeah, that's okay. That's a good technical term. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's what he's trying to go for here. Because I would say that, in some ways, that's how religion prospers. The more intriguing argument he's making is that, no, when things really go bad, the version of religion that winds up emerging is the one that is the quackiest.
I think that's what he's saying. And I think
Yeah.
he's saying also that we are attracted to horror when the world is going wild.
Maybe,
because horror seems, and this is something like, this is the Bruno Bettelheim theory about why children like fairy tales, or why we read fairy tales to children, is because the horrors of the world are uncontrollable. Right. Whereas in a fairy tale, like, it may be scary,
there's a structure,
but there's a structure, and we know how it's going to end.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, I can that.
I honestly think that we're confused because he's a little confused.
Yes.
Like, this is like, it's a very smart political analysis that he just did.
Right.
And then here, this is a little of King trying to make sense of his place in the world, right?
I think you're right. Again, like, there's aspects of this where you can feel King fumbling towards something, and I don't think he quite has the right grasp on it just yet. Yeah. But like, he has a grasp on a lot of other stuff, which again makes this incredibly good. So yeah. Speaking of having a grasp on things, Anna, I have a question for you.
Yes, Dan.
Is there a critique of capitalism in this novella?
Dan, I'm going to tell you all the lies capitalists keep in reserve for bad situations. The ones that sound so damn plausible to a child. And I will tell you them in a tone of perfect conviction. The critique of capitalism. I mean, the one guy who tries to uphold the market, right? Mm-hmm. Literally uphold the market in this story is treated as a fool. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
But I think there's a more interesting kind of read too, which is just the question of, and there isn't anything more than that, because I think most people intuitively are kind of like, well, in a real crisis situation, of course you would like eat the stuff in the store, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's a crisis, and we would have, riots happen after a little while.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In the immediate aftermath of a catastrophe, people do tend to kind of like, all right, I guess we got to share.
Right. This is the Rebecca Solnit argument that you and I have both made, which I think is very plausible. It's plausible for a short period of time. Things can fall apart, but at least in the immediacy, you're absolutely right.
And you can take advantage of that too. Like, if you operate in the right way, you probably can keep people together for a while. Mm. And I believe that. Here's the thing, Dan. I think we're in that crisis. I think that we are not sharing and sharing alike for some reason. And I think it's because people don't realize the circumstances we're in. There are creatures in the midst, Dan, coming to get us. Creatures born of humans fucking around with nature. Hurricanes and droughts and heat waves and fires and novel coronaviruses and food chains collapsing and a lack of groundwater. Like, I was doing research for this TNR piece that I wrote that hopefully will be out by now. People are listening to this. Last year, there were 3 million adults displaced in America because of catastrophes related to climate change.
Okay.
Now, that's not a lot for the whole country, right?
But that's still a lot of people. That's
a lot. It's actually like 3 times as many in any year past.
Oh, that's interesting. Wow. Okay.
We are getting to a point, and then the Times just did a big story about the lack of groundwater, groundwater crisis. Like, artisanal? They're not artisanal. Artesian? What are the wells? The wells. The wells.
You mean groundwater wells?
Groundwater. That there's wells. Anyway,
okay,
wells. I know, because there's one in Austin that are going dry. Actually, here in Austin, Barton Springs, which most people who've been to Austin know something about, it's kind of an infamous natural swimming hole. It is like shrunk in half. Like, there are several natural spring swimming holes here that are going to have to close because it's a drought, but not just a drought. We have used up the reserves of water that we have.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And I feel like this doesn't get it's depressing, but like, this is an existential crisis, Dan.
It is. The problem is, I know
this.
Look, Anna, I teach a course called The End of the World, so I'm certainly sympathetic to this. The problem is that in a way, it comes out like the mist, but without the creatures. It's just this slow rolling mist. And the problem is that it's precisely because it's slow moving, and this is where the King novella is different from what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Even like, Norton thought that something weird was going on at first. Like, everyone acknowledged this was something weird, and like we have to react and change our behavior as a result. The problem is that the crises that we are experiencing in the real world have been so slow moving that everyone thinks they have time. I know.
Yeah. If we want to wait for them to get to be the bugs, like the sucker bugs slamming up against the plate glass window, like we'll get that.
Yeah.
And in our lifetime, in the past 10 or 20 years, it has gotten worse.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I don't know. I was just, again, I just read this piece in the Times about groundwater, and like looking at my fucking phone, I have, the last 3 alerts I've gotten on my phone, Dan. One is for heat precautions, right? It's going to be another, it was only 99 today, but it's been 100 degrees almost every day since July. And then I got a notice about water usage. And then I got a notice about air quality.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
Next, flying bug-sucking creatures. I don't know. We can go on. I think our listeners are. I am, as it were, preaching. I am Mrs. Carmody preaching
your flock
to the
is already there.
Converted.
Yeah.
Yes, my flock is already there. But
wait.
Sometimes I get frustrated.
I'm hearing bugs. Oh my god! It's a tentacle thing. It's the debris field. This is when we have things that we have not talked about yet that we will bring up in the final portion of the podcast.
That's a very you wore a suit for this episode, and I feel like that was your suit talking.
That was my suit talking. I feel like, what was the other store manager's name? Not Ollie, the fool.
Bud?
Bud, yes. I feel like Bud wearing this. I think that was part of the reason why I kept this on. Yeah. Yes. Anna, what do you have?
I have a bunch of stuff that are just the pretty writing that I wanted to mention. And there's a few from the beginning. He talks about the storm coming in. He says, I could see the delicate call of rain extending down. Use the word call there is, I wouldn't have thought of it. Again, that's so short a sentence, but I know what he's saying. And another really short thing, he's talking about some live wires on the ground, which is where he first experiences terror for his son, right? There are live wires down from the storm. And he says, one of them humped up and turned over lazily as if beckoning. Like, gorgeous and true and scary. All of that.
Yeah.
Dan, what about you? I've got a few more, but I'll just paste them out. I'll paste
them. I was going to say, I'm going to look through the writing. In terms of character beats, I did want to say, I did like the contrast. I think that there were 2 other leaders that I didn't talk about. One was Mike, who was like a local town selectman, and the other was Dan, who was an out-of-towner from like Massachusetts. And what was interesting was, again, it's not a huge thing, but I like what King did, which is Mike, who is supposed to be the elected leader, clearly is pretty useless. His instincts are right, but he can't like lead anyone. Dan, on the other hand, funny, sharp, like he's the one who first thinks we've got to defend ourselves. Like, he doesn't make a wrong decision. I think there's actually a brief moment where David says, like, he was the kind of guy that you liked immediately, and then over the longer term wanted to dislike because he was right and like better than you were. And speaking of writing, that's a lovely, like, that captures a sentiment that we have all experienced, encountering other people. And so that was extremely well done. Go ahead.
I will give a shout out to all the brand names that he uses, which I always kind of registers in my head, because when I had that argument that I eventually got sent to the hall about, one of the points that my English teacher made was that King uses all these brand names, and that's like commercialist or whatever, like. That it dates it, and it's bad to use like brand names in writing a story, which I don't know. I was like, what? That's just life. Like, what do you mean? Like, we use things that have brands, Yeah. And maybe it is weird. Like, he mentions Lancer's wine, which I am old enough and you are old enough to remember that green bottle.
I do not remember that bottle. I got to say.
Oh, you don't?
No.
I remember maybe my mom, drank a lot of wine, but I remember it was a green glass bottle, kind of a low market, but I know exactly what he's talking about. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So there is you can do a kind of drinking game, as it were, with King stuff when he mentions for every time he mentions a brand name.
So speaking of writing, I just want to, and this confirms something you said before. Again, just a very simple paragraph where David is describing Billy. And at the beginning, before anything bad happens, he says, he ran back and I watched him go, legs pumping, soles of his Zori showing. I love him. It's his face and sometimes the way his eyes turn up to mine. They make me feel as if things are really okay. It's a lie, of course. Things are not okay and never have been. But my kid makes me believe the lie.
Yeah.
And again, it perfectly captures the way he feels about his son. It's the way we all feel about our children, Yeah.
Yeah, I could even talk about Billy more because Billy, as someone who's, again, a child skeptic, Billy's a complete character.
Yeah.
And how rare is that in literature, period?
But I will
have a child in an adult novel
right.
who isn't a main character,
right.
but is a full character.
But I will say, this is, again, and I think about contrasting with the movie, Billy doesn't work in the movie.
Oh, no.
Billy is an annoying little shit in
child
the movie.
Actors are terrible.
And it's not, no, I don't think it's even the child. It's just like David describing him works. Seeing it actually on the screen, it's very different. And it's off-putting in a way. And so it was, again, this is why I think the novel is better.
I love also that Billy is imperfect.
Yeah, of course.
He's not the character trait that King gives him is that he's like a little literal, serious kid.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And of course he also makes that charming, but like there's a scene where he makes one joke, Billy makes a little joke. And
David is so proud of him because it shows growth on him. So again, just well done. What else? What do you?
We've talked about so much. I mean, I just don't have a lot besides some of the pretty writing that I wanted to mention. So
the only other thing I would beyond the writing is I did again, this is where the novella was better than the film. They reference the Arrowhead project.
Oh yeah.
That the military is working on. In the book, it's cleverly referred to a couple of times. But we have no idea if it was responsible for what happens in the mist. And that was the right way to handle that. In the movie, it is made literal in a way that it makes it leaden and it is bad. So, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Any more good writing you want to sound out?
Well, I wanted to actually take back, I called it pretty writing, which is something I sometimes say about, there is something that's called, I consider pretty writing.
No, but this isn't pretty writing.
It's not pretty. Yeah. It's actually all of these really concise things that are in
efficient.
The service of a larger theme. And I'm going to have to teach this. I just realizing now I'm going to have to teach this. Anything else? It's good. You should read the whole Skeleton Crew book if you're into it. I think it has a bunch of I don't read as much as short stories anymore, but I really loved Skeleton Crew when it came out.
Okay.
I think it has his one Quitters Inc., which is in the Cat's Eye movie. Have you ever seen that movie?
No.
With Drew Barrymore. It's a quartet of King's short stories.
Huh. Okay.
And Quitters Inc. is about, spoiler alert a little bit, but it won't, it still works. It's about a company that helps people quit. In this particular story, it's smoking, although I think everyone understands that's not really what King's writing about.
Yeah.
By killing or harming your loved ones. If
you do that? Oh my God. Jesus. Wow. Okay. Wow. All right.
They start with cutting off fingers. Sorry, it is spoiler, but it is, he's writing about alcoholism, right?
Yeah.
Because people still relapse.
Yep.
Even though
right,
terrible things might happen to your loved ones, addiction works.
Yep.
On that level. Addiction makes you do that stupid kind of shit.
Oh God, by the way, that in the film version of The Mist, I actually winced because at one point when they go to the pharmacy, Ollie is excited because he finds the OxyContin.
Oh God.
Because that was during the peak OxyContin is a pain reliever phase, and it dates the film more than anything else is the reason I know that. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's it. Dan?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
All right.
I think that's
it. So if you have not already become a patron, if this hasn't thrown you for whatever reason, if you want more of this and you want it earlier in your life, you want to be able to listen to our dulcet tones over the weekend at your leisure rather than on Mondays or during the week. If you become a patron, you get episodes early. You also get to join our Discord, which I mentioned up top. Discord's amazing. It's a great little community. We recently started a fantasy football league, the nerdiest football league in America. Pretty sure. I mean, I'm sure there's like an MIT league or whatever.
Yeah,
that we are called One League to Rule Them All.
Nice.
There is an Adorno division. I am in it. Nice. My team's name is the Fighting Shogoloths, which is the
Lovecraft. Yeah.
Lovecraft.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's a wonderful community. We do all kinds of fun stuff. And then other reasons, there's someday we're going to have merch, whatever. Like
we have monthly AUAs that you can participate in. And, again, early access to the podcast. Also, at some point we might do a live recording, the two of us together.
Yes, we have dared the Discord.
We have dared the Discord. If they can produce enough people that would be willing to meet us in person, we will do that. We can even tell this. I will tell the story completely about that blog panel that we met in 2004.
Anything else about joining? You get episodes early. We do occasionally special episodes. We haven't done one in a while. But and then we're going to do a special episode once we get into 250
yes.
patrons.
We're going to do a special episode about a topic chosen by the patrons, only available to the patrons. The topic doesn't have to be sci-fi. It can be almost anything. We are going to veto certain things. We're not going to talk about games. We're not going to talk about 9-hour movies about the Holocaust. You got to show.
I put my foot down on that one.
Yep. But otherwise, you can make us do a rom-com. You can make us do, Avatar. You can make us do whatever. So, yeah.
And then, Dan, let's do our pluggables. What do you got?
By the time this comes out, we'll have a piece in Foreign Affairs on the website. On the
website, www.foreignaffairs.com.
Well, it's not in the print version. It'll be online, and it's about basically the ways that the rest of the world are now having to hedge or plan for a possible second Trump term. Speaking of the mist coming. And you have, Anna, your big TNR piece, hopefully. Right?
I have this big TNR piece coming out. Cover story, Dan.
Ooh.
It's my first cover story in a long time.
Nice.
Anywhere. So I'm very excited about it. I am on Instagram at Anna Marie Cox. You and I are both on
Blue Sky.
I haven't been there a while, but you're pretty active.
I'm reasonably active. Yes, I like it. And I have a Substack.
I
have a Substack. It's called Dresner's World. Doing pretty well, actually. I keep knocking on wood about that because Anna keeps expecting it to fail, but I understand why.
Not yours. I want to be very clear.
Yes,
not
the larger enterprise,
but the larger project of journalists trying to support themselves with newsletters.
And I am not trying to support myself, which is, I think, why it is working reasonably well. So that's yes. And
speaking of journalists trying to support themselves,
yes, Anna.
My writing workshop is starting in October. Mm-hmm. It is a memoir writing workshop, 10 weeks, small class.
Oh, wow.
Once a week for a couple hours. I have office hours available for people for one-on-one stuff. If you go to the website is
www.annamariecox.com, pronounced differently from her actual name, Anna Marie Cox.
For no particular reason. It's just the rules.
Yeah.
There are blurbs from former students and information about how to sign up. And I really love doing it.
Good.
It's brought a lot of joy to my life, and I think it's done some good in the world. So if you're interested, folks,
you should sign up.
And then Rebecca Roanhorse, musicals, other stuff.
We've got other stuff in the hopper.
We might be doing a lot of retrospectives considering this strike that's happening.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And until then,
keep this channel open for more.